morning, everyone. Hey, was that too loud? Welcome to this session on legacy and nonprofit philanthropy. I'm Rose Chan Louie, and I am the executive director of a center at UCLA Law School called the Center for Philanthropy and Nonprofits. I think some of you I got to meet and see at an art convening that we did earlier this year, which we hope to do again in 2025. I'm also the board chair of East West Players, so that's my arts hat. So, and we agree that we would say a little bit about our personal connection to the arts. My first love is dance. I could not wait till my mom would let me get into a ballet class. So, and it, I think I'm happiest when I get to be moving. And I'll pass that on to my daughter, who also, I'm so happy, loves dance. And after years of ballet, the one thing she could still do and do law school was to be a Philadelphia Eagles cheerleader. So she's doing that at the same time. Anyway, I'm really excited to have you here today. First, I'm going to, let's see, I'm trying to decide what order this is. Sarah and Alvaro, why don't you introduce first, and then I'll jump into the topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because we could probably talk all day about our connection to the arts. I am Sarah Lighting. Good morning. I'm the executive director of the Music Man Foundation, which is a private foundation that funds things across the country, but also many, many programs here in Southern California. And so am I sharing a little bit about myself, a little bit about the foundation? Okay. Before working with the Music Man Foundation, I had worked with another family foundation that was based here in Los Angeles. And then before that, I was an arts sector worker. I worked at both Center Theater Group and the Pasadena Playhouse here in Southern California. So I have a long history with the arts, was a kind of dabbled in my arts training as a kid, but was a professional audience member, and feel really grateful that my family valued that, and that's how we spent a lot of our time, was going to see dance and opera and music and a lot of theater. And so the Music Man Foundation, just to give some context on the foundation's work, we have our catchy name because Meredith Willson, who wrote the musical, The Music Man, the foundation is funded by his estate. It was actually started by his widow, Rosemary, and she started the foundation close to the end of her life. And after she passed away in 2010, was when we sort of entered into the current iteration that we're in. And so fairly young, fairly new foundation, focused mostly on music, but to just share a little bit of the evolution of the foundation, when I first started, which I was the first staff person, we were pretty exclusively kind of music education in public school classrooms, with a credentialed teacher, and some music therapy programs for pediatric populations. And those were our two lanes, and we stayed in them. And after doing that for a while, attempting to be quite thoughtful about the impact that the foundation could have, we knew we wanted to, what can we do to move the needle further? Music in the classroom is what is needed, but what can we do kind of to shift underlying circumstances to really establish it as, in a more permanent way or more sustainable way. And so our grant making has evolved to be more about any area where there is music and systems change. And then to complement that, we make grants to advocacy organizations like Arts for LA, because we acknowledge that that's really a necessary complement to the direct service work to really kind of have that impact. And I'll pause there. I could talk a whole lot more about Meredith Willson, but I think I'll pause there and let's hear from Alvaro.
Hey everybody, that's loud. My name is Alvaro Marquez. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am the program officer for arts and culture at the California Community Foundation, where I oversee our grant making in the nonprofit arts and culture sector. I also oversee our fellowship for visual artists, which we celebrated 35 years of the fellowship this year, providing unrestricted $40,000 grants to artists and professional development opportunities, which I'm really proud of. Prior to CCF, I've been there for a year. I was employed at the Getty Museum in the education department, where I ran our field trip program and developed an internship for East Los Angeles college students to become museum educators. I'm also an alum of the Arts for LA Activate program from 2016 to 2017, where I did the cultural policy track. And so I'm really grateful to the advocacy and the professional development that I received there, because it literally led to me being here on stage now. So I just want to acknowledge the organization. I've also been a teaching artist for many years. I've worked for organizations like PS Arts, Self-Help Graphics, LACMA, Museum of Latin American Art. Aside from my work in philanthropy, I'm also an educator. I was teaching printmaking at USC for the last 2 years in Roski, and I'll be teaching at Cal State Long Beach next semester. Yeah, Long Beach. I'm an alum there, so and I say all that because all of that history informs the work that I do in philanthropy. Like, I come from a working class immigrant background where I had very little access to the arts growing up. And so a lot of my advocacy is ensuring that marginalized people have access to cultural expression, because as we all know in this room, it's so important to so many factors. And so that is very central to the work that I do. My entry point into the arts was actually theater. I did theater in middle school and high school, but I never considered myself a theater kid because I was very awkward. I am also a trained printmaker. Later in life, I moved to LA to go to graduate school. I was writing about art, and then I hit 30 years old and I had like a crisis, and I was like, I want to make art. I don't want to write about it. So I went to Cal State Long Beach to get my degree in printmaking, where I graduated in 2020, right? Like at the peak of the pandemic. And so I say all this because I am a practitioner, I am an artist, I'm an educator, and I just happen to work in philanthropy, and I just wear those multiple hats, and I think that they all inform one another.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think we come from a diversity of perspectives. I think what I came at all of this from the legal point of view before going to UCLA to start this center. I represented organizations such as California Community Foundation. And so you'll probably hear that as I ask my questions. But so the overview of the topic. So I think I know with my East-West Players hat on, for example, that there's been a great deal of anxiety about philanthropic support for the arts. And I hear particularly by family foundations. And so I think the overarching question that we were asked is, how do we engage funders and encourage them to come back? And then as I was looking at the title and the overall theme of this conference, we were asked to explore these questions through the lens of legacy. And so I started to think, is that the key to our funding issues, is a focus on legacy? Because I think all of us personally think about what legacy we leave behind, and then our organization's legacy. And this seems to be, when we think about it, what drives us and our organization. And so with that, setting that context, let's dive in. I thought we'd start with a couple big picture questions for each of you. How do you see the role of arts in civil society, and how does that affect your foundation's grant making?
I'll start us off. For me, artists are central to movements for social justice. And that's something that I wear on my sleeve, and I say off the bat. I think that as a student of history, artists have been central to imagining dismantling systems of oppression, of imagining more equitable and just futures. So that's very central. I had the privilege at CCF of coming on board. I have a job because Mackenzie Scott saw the work that we were doing, and she gave us a transformative gift. And CCF, unfortunately, had left the arts grant-making sector in 2016, which a lot of people were really upset about, understandably. And Mackenzie Scott gave us a really sizable gift, and I was given the privilege of crafting the strategy. And so I took about 6 months interviewing folks like Sarah, interviewing a lot of people in the sector, and just with my lived experience, and I created a strategy that has 3 pillars. And I won't bore you with the details, but one of those pillars is looking at narrative change projects, because I think that the right wing is very organized and well-funded in shaping narratives that spread hate, misinformation, and division. And so I really think that personally, philanthropy should be involved in supporting artists who are those truth tellers, who are those trusted messengers in society, who are part of the communities that we're trying to rally and support. And so right now we are supporting documentary projects. The fellowship that I oversee, now that I'm running it, I ensure there's racial equity in how we decide who our fellows are, because we are supporting the diverse voices that are shaping the narratives and the stories, because we know that policy follows culture. Oftentimes we have to change cultural attitudes and cultural norms. That leads to a change in policy. That leads to change in the ballot box. So I think artists need to be front and center in these movements.
Thank you, Alvira.
Yes, here, and valued accordingly. I mean, that's for the Music Man Foundation. Music is at the heart of it. It's at the absolute center. So we have tried to sort of put the question of why the arts, like, in the rearview mirror. You know, they are essential. They are how we understand each other. They are how we learn about one another. They are how we heal. We just see it as so central. They are how, we promote social change. And so, my pen is going to fall here. So we just see it as essential and absolute, and we don't question it. And we, and quite honestly, I applaud that sometimes, in cross-sector work, there needs to be that moment of sort of validating why it's important to have the artists there. But we're kind of tired of sitting in the room and validating that argument. It's this work is valuable and necessary, and I think that's so. No further.
Yes, so I think maybe digging into that, into going from the big picture to how we interact with you as potential grantees. Is that an essential part of the application, or you already accept that and we don't need to explain to you why our work is important?
For the Music Man Foundation, you don't have to explain why it's important. Now, that said, we're interested in arts and systemic impact, and arts and systemic change. So that sometimes for us is challenging, because whereas we don't need to be convinced, I'm trying to kind of choose my words carefully here. We don't need to be convinced of the importance of the arts, but sometimes performing arts, the performance on the stage, that alone isn't necessarily going to create system change. It's some of the community work around that we believe is really what changes things. So for us, so just to be specific, kind of don't have to make the arts argument, but we specifically are looking for it to be in this broader context of systemic change.
That's very helpful, I think.
I mean, for me, I've been in this position for a year, so I'm still a baby funder, learning how to do this. But one of the things that I always do when I do have a meeting with a nonprofit leader, I try to disarm the power dynamic and tell them off the bat, you don't have to convince me of the validity of your work. If I'm having this conversation with you, it's because I've already vetted you and I want to support you. And I just say that off the bat. You don't have to convince me that the arts matter. Like, this is a no-brainer for me. And I think that kind of sets the stage to have a more frank conversation about what that support can look like, how I can incorporate into my strategy. I had a meeting with an organization in Pomona which does youth organizing, and the lead fundraiser there was trying to give me a pitch about why it was important to use the arts to politicize the youth, to get them involved in organizing. And I said, you don't even have to convince me. Like, To me, it's a no-brainer, and I find that's my job. I have to do the convincing to other funders. I have to do the convincing within my organization. When I arrived at CCF, I made sure that when I came up with my strategy, it intersected with every single funding area that we do at CCF. Because to me, the arts is health, it is education, it is economic opportunity. So that work falls on me as a funder to do the advocating and to connect those dots. And the work shouldn't be having to be done by our grantees.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. So I don't know if this is on your minds, but as a board chair of one of the nonprofits, how do we stand out as applicants? How do we show impact, and what could impress you? What are you looking for?
Well, at the Music Man Foundation, we have moved towards, we don't prescribe what the progress marks should be. But what we are seeking is organizations to speak very clearly and thoughtfully about what the benchmarks are for yourself. So it's, and that was a big step for us. Move away from, it doesn't have to be that there are 30 kids in a classroom or 300 kids in an after school or this many kids got violins. Like, it was a movement where we needed to move away from those sort of metrics, discuss with the organizations about what their metrics for progress are. And so what stands out is some really thoughtful and intentional ideas about what progress looks like, and acknowledging, and I think this is important, acknowledging that we know that progress isn't going to happen in 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, but that there is a thought process about, okay, what can this look like, and what are we going to kind of do to chip away at that? And I hope that that's felt by other, I hope that that's something that's shared by other funders as well, is that we can't anticipate that a 12-month grant is going to, change the world. And so being realistic about that, and just really hearing from the organizations about what those progress marks are, and what are the ways that you find it. That's something that we ask. And I'll say this, I sense that it's something that organizations actually you all have a lot of data collection methods, but sometimes you're doing it so it's so baked in that it doesn't kind of emerge as well, here's how we know. Like, we survey, and we do this, and we talk to the kids, we talk to the parents. It can be so multifaceted sometimes. So one thing I'm interested in is always hearing about the multiple ways that both quantitative and qualitative data is collected towards those progress marks.
I mean, I speak from the perspective of a community foundation, so I put the asterisk. A community foundation is supposed to reflect the needs of the community. That's how I see it. So when I'm engaging with potential grantees, I'm looking at an authentic response to community needs, right? And because I believe in racial and cultural equity, and I think that, I'm going to say it, sometimes we perpetuate white supremacy by having these really strict standards of excellence. So I look at merit as opposed to excellence, because I think that if you're going to judge an organization on past accomplishments, then you have to understand what has limited them from achieving that excellent standard, right? Because I'm less impressed by an organization that has a consultant and a board member that's hitting me up, and more impressed by an organization that hasn't reached that level and has maybe their ED doing all the fundraising, right? Because I think that's one of the ways that I'm ensuring equity. That's not to say I'm not going to fund the well-oiled machine, because I'm not going to punish an organization for being good at what they do. But when I'm calculating these factors, I'm taking into consideration what possibly is limiting this organization. And because we're not a huge funder, I don't have the biggest budget. A lot of family foundations, private foundations give out much larger grants than I do. But because I have the agency as a program officer to make strategic investments, I'm looking for merit and opportunity, where something like maybe a $50,000 grant is going to get this organization into the next level, build up their capacity, build up their leadership. So again, I speak from the community foundation perspective, And I just think it's really important for me to think about how to be as equitable as possible in that process.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Led me to think of another question, which is, since we're on the theme of legacy, how you respond to, or whether it's a factor at all, whether an organization wants to try use funds for capacity building and or to reserve funds, like set up some kind of quasi-endowment, some kind of cash reserve so that they can be more financially sustainable for, multiple years.
So, I mean, I operate when I arrived on the scene in philanthropy, I engaged in the trust-based model, right? Which is where you don't ask too many questions. You believe, but you confirm, right? What you're told. You have to do your due diligence. But I offer unrestricted support. And so I try not to tie any strings. In some cases, I have to outline some programmatic objectives. If the organization, say, has a national reach, we can only fund work in LA. So if it's an organization with national reach, I will put stipulations that the funding has to be used in LA County. If it's for a public art project, I will very clearly say it has to be used for this. But for the most part, I try to offer multi-year unrestricted general operating support. And if the organization wants to use that as a reserve, I'm not going to penalize them for that. If the organization wants to use it for salaries or for a project, I think that's part of the approach of trust-based philanthropy. I think that one of the things that philanthropy folks can do are responsible for is not having that God complex of telling the organization how they should operate, but really trusting them to understand their needs much better than we do.
Sarah?
And similarly, we are, I would say about 60% of our grant making is now multi-year general operating support. So we are moving towards more and more of that. And absolutely, if an organization uses that for, once it is granted and the grant contract is signed that says for general operating, if it's used to start a cash reserve or a quasi-endowment or a capital project, that's okay. That is allowable and celebrated. And I think, I would even say that as we've started doing that, and perhaps it's because we had an earlier history of doing a lot of very project-specific support, but one grantee who had received multi-year general operating support at the end of it said, "Oh, could we have used that on our building project?" And yes, they could have. So absolutely. So we're trying to do more and more of that. We know it's what is being requested from the field. We know it's so valuable. It's so helpful in longer term planning to know that that budget line is fulfilled. And so trying to do more of that.
That's really great to hear, because I think sometimes you feel like you need to put on that big show and all of that. But that also we've had issues, I think, for years at a lot of organizations where we've underpaid our staff, or we're severely, we just really don't have the capacity. So it's really encouraging to hear that. So kind of more, the next thing is, what can we do wrongly that we should avoid in terms of whether it's, either as grantees, what can we do wrongly that you'll tag us as, let's not give a grant to that organization again, or in our applications. Yeah. Do you have bad stories to share?
I'll share a story, right? I'm an educator. I've been an educator for over 20 years now. I used to be a really tough educator in the classroom, very strict, very demanding, kind of fascistic. I was like, you're here to learn and I'm going to teach you. And that did not work, right? That you lose students that way. And so now I practice empathy in how I teach. And I tell my students, I want to give you an A. Meet me halfway and we'll get you there. And that's my approach to grant making. I'm not a harsh critic. I mean, I'm pretty harsh. Sometimes I'm on panels for the county and for the city. And if an organization is being disingenuous about their commitment to diversity, and it's obvious in like who's in leadership positions, like had one organization was like 56% of our staff is Latino, and I said, and none of them are in your leadership role, so that's a problem. So if you're lying to me about your commitment to diversity, I will pick up on it. I have a radar for that. So I just look, like I said earlier, a genuine commitment to community needs. And I think funders can smell BS when we see it. So don't try to lie to us, because I think like it's evident, like if you are really committed to diversity and equity, it's going to show in your programming, in your staffing, and in your budget.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I would just say, you mentioned and I know you were kind of joking about, when you're putting on the show, and I would say, don't put on the show. I mean, site visits have become an increasingly more important portion of our grant decision making, and it doesn't have to be overly performative. The kids don't have to sit and I go to a lot of concerts. You can probably tell those are all my examples. But kids don't have to sit perfectly lined up and play the music just right. It's actually thoughtful discussions with the leadership that are really valuable, and courageous conversations around the reality of what's happening, the reality of what the challenges that your organization might be facing outside of the finances, and yeah, just to, and also to, when site visits, and this is speaking for Music Band Foundation, but something we're trying to get better about is when we're doing site visits, just having like a really open dialogue up front about what the site visit's going to constitute. Like, how long are we going to be there, and who needs to come? What should it look like, so that it's most efficient use of sort of everyone's time, and then it doesn't have to be anything performative, that it doesn't need to be.
What are you looking for from leadership, whether it's the artistic or executive director or board members? What makes good leadership that would help support an application?
And what instantly comes to mind, and it backs up what Alvaro already said, which is honesty. Just it's okay to be honest about the way things are, and I think that arts funders who are in the trenches know that it's hard. So it doesn't have to be, the story doesn't have to be spun any other way, except this is hard. Here's what makes it hard. And I don't want to, and I'm not the person of doing, and here's all the successes and all the things to celebrate too, like the honest story of that too. I don't want to make it sound like, just be honest about the tough stuff. The honesty about the successes too. And you mentioned board members and on site visits. For myself, I think it's fantastic when there are board members there, but it's really only fantastic when they're there and they can give you the honest scoop on what's going on, and not when they're there sort of as the face of the entity that perhaps might be a little more out of touch. So, I share that as sort of utilizing certain board members can be a great asset at times.
I mean, I would echo what Sarah's saying. I value transparency and honesty, because, I can't understand the needs of our organization if I don't know what challenges you're facing. Because, part of my job is not just to extend a grant to you, but to find other ways to amplify your work, to be a champion, to connect you to other resources. I also, because of my privilege and my position, I know a lot of funders. So I can send an email to Sarah and say, hey, I met a really great organization. Our grant is limited. Just put them on your radar. What do you think? And like, we all know each other. All the art funders, we know each other. We go to the same events. We fund the same organization. So I want to be your champion, and I can't do that if you're not transparent. But because I also, this is kind of, I'm going to beat a dead horse here. I focus so much on racial equity and cultural equity. I want to make sure that the leadership is reflective of the community you're serving, because I think that's one of the problems, my critiques of the nonprofit sector, having been a nonprofit employee for so long, that it's really important that the people you're serving are reflected in your leadership, in your staff, and the people providing service, and not just at the entry-level positions, but really, like, what does your board look like? Do you have people of color on your board? If you're serving people of color, why don't you have people of color on your board? And I think, like, I understand there's more complex dynamics, and I'm not going to penalize an organization because they have a well-resourced board with a lot of connections. That's obviously very important. But I do look for diversity, and it's not just like a tokenization. Like, I think that diversity matters in the decisions that you make and how you organize communities and how you provide those services.
Perfect segue into the next topic. So this is a little bit with my legal hat on. So last year, the Supreme Court ruled in Students for Fair Admissions versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College that race may not be used as a factor in college admissions. And, at that point, I think we were telling, I'm not in private practice anymore, but the advice generally was that's applicable to the admissions process. It's not necessarily needs to be applied in other contexts, and specifically in the nonprofit and philanthropy context. Since then, though, lawsuits have been filed against private companies applying the logic in that case to DEI initiatives. And that started to create some fear on the part of nonprofits and philanthropy. One of those cases was filed against the Fearless Fund. They're a venture capital fund, but they have a Fearless Foundation. And the foundation was running a grant-making contest for Black American women entrepreneurs. And the 11th Circuit, which is not applied to us here in California, ruled that it was most likely that that contest violated Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination in the making of private contracts, which I will confess to me seemed like we just turned it on its head. But anyway, these attacks on race-based grant-making have caused some funders to rewrite their race-based programs to instead focus just on factors such as socioeconomic class and marginalization. So basically avoiding any mention of race, while other funders are urging their peers to stay the course. So I'm just wondering how I think I can take a guess, but how are your foundations handling this issue that's out there?
I'm grateful that I work at a social justice-oriented organization led by people of color. We had an all-staff meeting when this decision came out. Our CEO said, we're doubling down. We're not, I was in another retreat with the Latino Community Foundation, and there was a great panel just on this topic. And they were talking about the fact that your attorney has to have the same relationship to risk as the organization, right? Because a lot of this is still up in the air. Like, I'm no lawyer. Rose probably knows a lot more about this than I do. But I do know that race and class and gender and sexuality, they're all imbricated systems, right? So for me, it's very simple. I said, well, fine, if I can't look at race, let's look at socioeconomic determinants, because we know that people of color, for the most part, have less access to resources, are more marginalized. So if that's the route I have to go, I'm willing to go that route. But so far, our organization has said, we're going to stay the course. Our board chair is Thomas Saenz from the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. So I feel like we have pretty strong standing in terms of like our legal approach to all this. But I know that as an organization, we're not going to back down. And we're actually scenario planning in case the worst happens November 5th. How can we continue to step in as a social justice oriented organization?
The Music Man Foundation hasn't, we haven't taken a stand per se. I think our approach is just to stay the course. But I can share, because just last week was the Grant Makers in the Arts Conference in Chicago, national conference of grant makers who are funding the arts, and lots of talk about this. And the generally, one person said, we're just going to keep going until we get sued. And then those that live in states that are more, where they have to take this a bit more seriously. Well, we all need to take it seriously, but in states where this is just a much more, discussed issue, definitely, there were funders talking about, using coded language in their applications, making their grant agreements seem less like contracts, changes. So I observe funders, generally staying the course, better yet, doubling down and modifying where they need to so that they can continue to support the grantees and the individuals that need it the most.
Yeah. So, I mean, 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I forgot to tell the ending. So basically, the Fearless Fund Foundation settled with the alliance that's going around suing everyone. And I think they just did not want more bad precedent on the books. And unfortunately, that is where we are. And so they decided we're going to deal with it kind of in this different way. But I'm with you. I feel like we're already giving up something but it might just be a matter of when we have the right people in place to review these cases. And right now, that's not the case if we're going all the way up. I think, will be okay in California for a while. In fact, in some ways, I'm hoping that there will be counter precedent to the 11th Circuit's precedent so that we have that to rely upon. But yeah, so just something to have in the back of your minds. But, personally, I hope we stay the course. Miguel actually spoke on our panel on this in the spring at UCLA Law, and he made very clear that you were staying the course. So I got the 10-minute warning that we should go into Q&A. So eager to hear your questions out there.
I'm curious if you were talking about how you your colleagues during conversation and others. What conversation that you having right now about some of the things that are like broad and in the session is like about many years on me, short of range timeline, you're expecting it, you service health, letting it impact.
I mean, I think one of the important things that I would add as a context to that is that there's an adage that if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. Every foundation is very different. You've got family foundations, you've got community foundations, you've got private foundations, you've got corporate foundations, and they all operate very differently. They have different structures of their grant making, different review processes. So as much as we talk, right, like we're also constrained by the limits of our organization. So it's definitely something that I'm a big champion for, is having quick, responsive grant making, unrestricted general operating support. But I'm also respectful of the fact that my colleagues have different organizations with different imperatives and different structures that they're operating under. So that's one thing that I would emphasize to you all, is to really, if you're looking for funding and you're developing relationships with funders, get to ask those questions of understanding what are their priorities, how do they operate, what are their structures, because that's what's going to help you understand how to really advocate for yourself.
And I just interject there, especially if you're making applications to private foundations and you are a social justice organization, you want to be careful how you write your grant application also, because they can't be seen as earmarking a grant that will go to legislative lobbying, for example, or none of the neither private nor public can be seen as funding political campaigning. But specifically legislative lobbying you can do, but you have to be careful how you write your grant application so that they can't make your grant to you. So just
Here.
Your question is a good one, and I think I'm sure we both wish the answer was that we really got together and were like, well, let's make sure our applications all look the same and are due at reasonable times, and we don't quite get there. And not to say that we shouldn't, but it's just sort of the reality of each with our own limitations. But we compare notes for sure. I think we observe each other's practices, and so just even sitting here with Alvaro today, we hear each other's practices and are always trying to improve our own. One thing that we have not yet implemented, but I hope to, is that reports, so grant, interim reports, final reports, can be whatever you've put together for another funder can be acceptable as the submission to the Music Man Foundation. There was another element to your question that I would just say you could always do more. But I think we do but we are in communication. We do compare notes. We do make recommendations about things that, bright spots that we're seeing. So, good.
Hi, I'm Melania for the Document for the Arts in the City of Savannah. So as someone who's coming into Sunday very the dumbest set, and a few incomer trying to get the graphs to you guys taking them into and before you guys the situation, but for the new next what's coming in, what is the best source or outline that we can find you guys more bigger? We need that sit down time part. We're too small, we're always very kind of fussy, things like that. But being that this person that doesn't truly have too much knowledge on the college stand very, very easily. Thank you so much for the stuff that you're asking. How can you stand out like that? What would you guys recommend you guys on this thing?
Sure. So I just want to say you're a current grantee. You're in my portfolio right now, so kudos to the work that you're doing. I don't know. I don't know if I have anything useful to add, because I think so much of this works on relationships, right? And that's one of the limitations of what we do, is that we work at the speed of trust and we're building relationships. And obviously, if you have social and political capital, you can have access to those relationships a lot more quickly and easily. So what I would say is to build community with other organizations, and don't be afraid to ask them, who's funding you? Who's giving you a grant? Is it the county? Is it the city? Is it a foundation? And if that person has some ethics, they will share resources with you and share those emails and that communication. Because I think as funders, like, it's literally our job to field these questions, right? And so, not to put the onus on you, but there's like research that you can do to kind of build up those relationships and that network and figure out from other people how they're getting their funding.
I was just kind of flying on there. I was just going to make a quick, so one of my big goals for the Center for Philanthropy and Education, not so much to necessarily introduce you to everyone, but we are trying to do educational type events like we did last year, and we'll do one in the spring again. So put yourselves on our mailing list, because I do a lot of, just yesterday we did a Zoom on advocacy and how you do it. So look for us online and put yourself on our mailing list. We'll start over there.
One thing you lots of people about is that invitation. I know, yeah. It's really what grant that's one thing. I thank you for once there's so I think how we carry the whole speed budget cuts right now. Us just top on the table, but I think the most should be brought over absolutely saying that's wonderful. The lab staff and I and some accounts and I do areas for organizations who do in the States.
By funding Arts for LA and California. I mean, we not to give a, we have a short amount of time. So to give kind of a quick answer, we see the lever to solving some of those cuts is by working in partnership with advocacy organizations like Arts for LA, like California for the Arts, because they are representing all of the, theoretically they're representing everybody that those cuts might be affecting. And their policy and advocacy agenda would help to restore that.
Sorry, I think there.
And then in tandem to that question, we know that funded usually get around 5% of TAP itself. Is there talk about increasing that 5% to 6%, 7%, to 8%, and where is that?
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I feel like we should be in the business of going out of business. I respect spend down foundations like Perenkio, which know that in 9 years they're not going to exist anymore. I think that's a problem with philanthropy, that we hoard wealth. But I also understand that the flip side to that is that you're trying to create impact that lasts 100 years, right? So that's always a delicate balance. I know at CCF, we have talks about how to increase our impact. Just out of transparency, most of our grant making comes from donors. Like I'd say about easily 60-70% of our grants come from donors. So our assets are sizable, and we do only give out 5%. And the rationale that I've heard is, CCF has been around for 100 years, and we want to be around for another 100 years. But I'm not in charge. If I were in charge, I say, let's spend the money out. Let's distribute the resources while we need them. But I also respect the counter argument.
You have commitments to your donors too that you have to respect.
I would say influx of applications that you are receiving back. Imagine, finding ways to increase that access might be helpful to, but for that influx of applications.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Lori.
No, Lori, so we're on the last question, I guess. We're getting the time. Last question.
This morning we're talking about Olympics, and we're talking about doing more programming and they pay for staff and more planning. So our foundation stating about the help for the groups to make it.
We just talked about that.
I had a meeting with Gustavo, the CEO, to figure out what's going on. I personally, I'm a team of one. I don't have a support staff. Everything arts related, everything fellowship related, I do at TCF by myself. So I have very limited bandwidth. But I did meet with Gustavo. I'm gonna reach out to Chris in Dakota, to Daniel Tarica from the Department of Cultural Affairs. I personally want to commit some money from my portfolio to help organizations. I mean, a lot of times my portfolio isn't very big, so I will support organizations like Arts for LA is a grantee, so we're probably going to keep continuing to support Arts for LA. But I personally am committed to making sure that the Cultural Olympiad is done in a way that is racially equitable, and that is, again, I'm beating a dead horse, that is responsive to community needs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's on our, I would say yes, it's on our mind. I would say yes, it depends on kind of size of staff and the plan. And I felt like the panel was doing a good job of giving us a bit of a timeline. Nora was saying that there's going to be a strategic plan coming out in the next, she thought, even few weeks. And so I would say, once there's more sort of a map and to understand what the needs are, I think a lot of organizations will step up. It's just more about what's it going to look like and where's the need. But people are excited for sure. We know the Olympiad has big implications for our community organizations. Wow. You guys, thank you. I know this conversation could go on for a while, and hopefully we can casually continue at lunch. Thank you.